Hello, CBC. This summer, because I wanted to highlight that there were human beings behind these statistics, I visited a prison in Oklahoma. And I sat down with inmates, and I listened to their stories. And one of the things that struck me was the crushing burden their incarceration has placed, not just on their prospects for the future, but also for their families. Mass incarceration rips apart families. It hollows out neighborhoods. It perpetuates poverty.
Families like Ingrid Archie's. As communications manager at a New Way of Life reentry project, Ingrid helps the formerly incarcerated re-enter society and reunite with their families. Having been incarcerated for cannabis herself, she was away from her own daughter for several years, and the effects of her imprisonment on her family were tremendous.
My daughter, she was pregnant and she had been molested while I was incarcerated. The trauma, it was like a big gap that we're still trying to mend now, you know, with a lot of therapy and stuff like that, but it took a really emotional toll on her.
Many things can put strains on the relationship of a parent and child, but none quite like incarceration. While the emotional trauma of being locked up seems obvious, the negative effects of having a family member behind bars are measurable, and yet the criminal justice system does little to support or even acknowledge the families of the incarcerated.
Not only do we have thousands and thousands of people who have been separated from their families in prisons and jails, but we take away those individuals' ability to provide for their families. We create more families that are dependent on less income and less working people in the household. Young people and children grow up to face more challenges with being separated from their parents. Families are devastated, and our communities are being devastated by mass incarceration.
When I was 22 years old, I found myself standing in a courtroom in Georgia watching my husband be sentenced to 15, serve 6 for a crime stemming from his drug addiction. I spent the next 7 years as a single mom, basically, and trying to hide the fact that I had a husband who was in prison. You know, it was embarrassing, and I felt stigma and shame. And it's a real burden on a family to have somebody who's incarcerated. The collect calls are extremely expensive. The burden to go and visit them costs money, obviously gas money, and people can be placed very far away from their families, sometimes across the country.
When you go to a prison, especially a federal prison, it's in the middle of nowhere, and then it's just like daunting. You know, you have like long roads that you have to drive up, you have to check in, you have to park in a certain area and walk far, and there's fences and barbed wire and guard things just like everywhere. So when I was a kid, I was like, oh my God, like this is insane. Like my dad is in here. I still get that like butterflies in my stomach because it makes me nervous.
It absolutely has tremendous negative consequences. I talked to so many kids who effectively lost their parent, and many of the people who I talked to who are incarcerated tried to continue parenting from inside prison, but it's really difficult when you can't be there every day.
Virgil Grant is co-founder of the California Minority Alliance and founder of California Cannabis, a cannabis activist and one of the first collective owners in California. Grant served 6 years in federal prison on marijuana charges.
There's really no parenting that you can do from a jail cell. They were able to visit. The visitation was Friday, Saturdays, and Sundays. You cannot truly get a quality visit from that position. You can talk about things, you know, how you doing, you know, how's school, you know, basic things, but there's no true parenting that you can do, not like being there in the home day to day to see what's going on. This is once a week. They come in for a few hours. You get in what you can get in for those few hours, and then they're back living their lives and you're back having to live the life that you're stuck in.
Inmates watch their families implode. Their children, especially sons, don't have a father. And whether people choose to believe it or not, many of these men would be excellent role models, to tell you the truth.
Farrell Scott is a case that's very dear to my heart because he has two beautiful children that desperately need their father. His son Skylar was going to go on to play pro football, but when Farrell went to prison, that was devastating because according to Farrell, they were inseparable and very close. It's just tragic. His career was devastated by the arrest of a parent.
People that do violent crimes don't even get life. I hate to say, I wish my daddy would have killed somebody. I feel like he wouldn't have had this much time. It don't make sense. Yes, it was a crime, but at the end of the day, like, what if in 5 years this is legalized in every state? You get what I'm saying? So it's just unfair.
I was very active in my children's lives. I was my children's high school track and field coach. I was there every day. I was the one who dropped them off at school and picked them up. It's ironic because I was driving my kids to school when I was pulled over by the local sheriff department, which pulled me out the car and handed me over to the feds. So you can kind of imagine the trauma that they had to deal with, seeing their father removed from them. Those are memories you can't erase. That's long-term trauma, damage, psychological damage to a child. And for any child to come out of that successful and unscathed, that's a challenge within itself.
A study at the University of California, Irvine found that the children of incarcerated parents were 3 times more likely to suffer from depression and twice as likely to suffer from learning disabilities and anxiety than the average child.
I used to cut myself because I was in so much pain and I didn't know how to handle it. And, it's not, the most healthy way, but I didn't know. Like, I just didn't know. And I think just in general, when you're a kid, you don't know how to handle what's presented in front of you. My brother was very adamant about not being in this present state. He always had to be on something. And my mom caught him huffing glue in his room alone. And it was about 3 years after my dad went away. So it wasn't just like, oh, I'm with my friends and partying and this is a thing. It's like, no, I don't want to feel this. And I get that. I've had that the same time as my brother, and we were both alone. We were both in the same situation, and we dealt with it very differently. And I regret it just about literally every second of the day that I wasn't stronger then and didn't help him.
The emotional impact for Lauren's brother and Craig's son was so severe that he died of a heroin overdose.
I wish I would have been, we all separated, when you really should come together and work through it and try to find ways to cope. And I really think that had he been home, my brother would still be here. So, yeah.
The effects of these circumstances are heartbreaking on the nearly 2.7 million American children who have a parent behind bars. In fact, recent research shows that children with an incarcerated parent are at a greater risk of dropping out of school, taking up delinquent behavior, and ultimately being locked up themselves. According to the Department of Health and Human Services, children of incarcerated parents are 7 times more likely to be locked up one day. Ingrid Archie's own father served time in prison.
I was placed in the foster care system. I wasn't able to stay with my dad because He was criminalized for a marijuana conviction, which meant that I had to be in the system. When kids are placed in the system, they don't check on the kids. They don't make sure that they get the proper therapy that they need to address any issues from being separated from their parents. And so a lot of anger brewed from that, me being basically left alone and detached from my parents, all because of a simple marijuana charge. And so whatever's going on with you, you're gonna figure out ways to get that anger out, and it's not always healthy. So the avenues that I chose to get my anger out landed me in jail.
What we call preschool to prison pipeline, we have to shut that down and let our kids know that there is a brighter future for them, and through the education that won't lead to ultimately incarceration due to the biased laws that have been created within our country.
I think that there should be things like mandatory therapy for children. Oh, your loved one goes to prison. Okay, let's find a way to handle this so that maybe it isn't repeated and you could be smart about it.
Overall, we need to be taking a more holistic look at this. If you're going to take somebody out of a home and put them into prison, it's going to have an impact on their family and on their children. And we need to look at what that impact is and how we can address that so that we don't fuel the vicious cycle of incarceration by leaving children of those who are incarcerated and spouses of those who are incarcerated in absolute poverty and unsafe conditions.
The effects of mass incarceration on the families of those behind bars is an unexpected consequence of the war on drugs. But without addressing the criminal justice system, we are doomed to continue the cycle of exploitation, disproportionate enforcement, and ultimately perpetuate the failure of the system as a whole. The change that must occur lies in the hands of our leaders, who continually need persuasion to act on what is just. Eliminate mandatory sentencing, repeal mandatory minimums for minor drug offenses and nonviolent crimes, encourage state governors and the president to increase pardons and commutations, and increase federal funding for social programs, not only for released offenders, but for their families. Red states are turning green. We'd got more votes than Donald Trump in California, Maine, Massachusetts, Nevada, Montana, and Florida.
I would say in 5 years, we'll probably have the whole country with some form of legalization.
Not one person on the city council would say that the war on drugs was a success.
We have to be vigilant. We have to continue our efforts. We have to expand. The politics are shifting, and we need to make sure that Congress doesn't get out of step.